I'm going to talk to you about interactions between two types of things that I do. As Corey said, I'm a CNRS researcher. I work at the University of Paris South. But this year, I'm at UCLA in Los Angeles. I have 1 year sabbatical just to rest and enjoy the beach and the gym in my residency, and perhaps do some stuff, but we'll see. So just a few words about what I do before I start. My research group is called Biodiversity Dynamics because I think it's a really cool name. And also it conveys the two main research interests we have in the group, population dynamics and conservation biology. So we are interested in a bunch of different topics, and we started with biological invasions that we handle with trophic web interactions, mostly on mammals and on islands. But we work also quite a lot on models. As Corey said, we've been working quite a lot on alley effects, mostly first with theoretical ecology, although now we do some experiments. And we've worked on many different species. Here, the African wild dogs, which you've all recognized. But other species and ants, for example, is the latest that we've been working on for the alley effect. As Corey mentioned, we've worked on the overexploitation of rare species or anthropogenic alley effect with different case studies, some of them in VIP receptions and supermarkets, some in zoos to study human behaviors, but we've also studied the species themselves. Here you have an example with trophy hunting and with traditional Chinese medicine, which are also two markets where this process can occur. And lately I've been working on a new set of topics related to climate change and the impact of climate change on biodiversity. This time with more statistical models, more at a macroecological scale, but also with some experiments and mostly with ants. So today I'm going to talk about two different projects that are put together, climate change and biological invasions. And in fact, I'm going to steal the work of my two latest PhDs that are both down now, Céline Bellard and Cleo Bertelsmeyer. And Cleo, some of you may know her. She spent some time here. So you recognize some of their work. So it's the core work of two PhDs that I've put here and try to put it in a single story. So the story is really set up in applied ecology. It's not theoretical ecology or fundamental ecology. It's in a setting where biodiversity is threatened with rates of species extinction that are exceptionally high, and where a large part of biodiversity could be lost within our lifetime. So that's something that is really applied, as I said, with 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss: habitat loss, biological invasion, overexploitation, pollution, and climate change. And we are interested, in fact, on the link between two of these major drivers of biodiversity loss. So biological invasions, you probably know everything about it. It's considered as often as the second largest threat to biodiversity. Well, I hope you understand my English. I was about to say my French. I hope you understand my accent. Yeah, good, because usually I don't understand yours. So we'll see with the questions. So biological invasions is quite interesting because it has a huge impact on biodiversity, but also on economics and on society. And that's probably one of the reasons why we still have money to do this research. And climate change has been studied for less long by ecologists than biological invasions. But we know also that even if it's not the cause of many extinctions now, it's likely to become the cause of extinction in the near future. On this graph, you can see here a kind of a summary of most of the things that are known on the impact of climate change on biodiversity and in terms of loss of biodiversity. There are two main things that you can extract from this quite messy graph. The first one is that it's very variable. According to the time horizon, the metrics that is used, the taxonomic group, you can have very different rates of biodiversity loss. And the second thing that you can take out of this graph is that in any case it's going to be significant and perhaps very large. So climate change, although we don't know much about it quantitatively, we know that it's going to have an important impact on biodiversity. And climate change is, of course, many different things. Probably cannot see it very well here, but it's not only global warming. It's raising temperatures, of course, but it's also rainfall, extreme events, CO2 concentration, ocean dynamics. There are many different things, and those things, they have an effect on very different scales on biodiversity, from the genetics to the biome integrity. And we are interested in most of these, but mostly we are interested in a level between the species and the population. That's the distribution of species. So we are going to look at the effect of climate change on the distribution of species, and not all species, invasive species. Why are we interested in looking at whether the climate, the change of climate is going to affect biological invasions? Simply because that's something that people have claimed in papers as a fact, that because climate is going to change, it's going to become more suitable to invasive species, and they are going to access to new territories. So it has been found several times in the literature that climate change is going to increase biological invasions. And we wanted to look at that because it had not been tested so far. So the approach that we took was to look at the effect of climate change on the potential area of suitability for invasive species. So we have not looked at invasions because it's in the future. We have looked at projections of increase or decrease of suitability of areas for the species that we are interested in. And for that, we took two different sets of data. We looked at one relatively small sample, both taxonomically and ecologically homogeneous. That's 15 species of invasive ants. So that's one family. When I say relatively small, that's the work of Cleo, and she wouldn't be happy if I said small, because 15 species, it's quite a lot when most people have worked on similar things with one species only. So she has done it 15 times. The other sample that we looked at was much larger. It's 100 species, but it's taxonomically and ecologically very wide. That's the famous or infamous list of the IUCN of the 100 of the worst invasive species. And the method that we've used is the same for the two, with some idiosyncrasies that come with the fact that there are two students working there. So they didn't take exactly the same things in the details, but the two methods are the same. It's the estimation of potential invasive range with bioclimatic models. So what's the bioclimatic models? I'm going to really skip over the methods very, I'm not going to go into details, but just to give you the idea. So all the red dots here are the occurrence records of the species that we are looking at. And with that, we looked at the current distribution, both in the native and the invaded regions. We exclude all the species that are in cities or that are in, for example, greenhouses. And then we take climatic variables, or also land use variables sometimes, but in the case of ants, it was climatic variables. And we look at the association between those climatic variables and the distribution. So for each point, each pixel for which we know there is an individual of this species, we look at the climate there with different variables. And with that, we can construct what is called the climatic niche, making the assumption that if the species is found there, it means that the climate is suitable for that species. So how to predict? We have the current climate with the variables that I just mentioned. In this case, we took 19 variables. It's a set that is classically taken for this kind of studies. And we have different modeling techniques to get from here to a distribution, a model of suitability of the species. And we make a consensus of the results of the 5 models. Or, if we look at the future, then we can take different CO2 emissions scenarios and different climatic model of the global circulation. And that makes us 6 climate projections for the future. And if we look at the 5 different techniques for the 6 projections, then we have a consensus with 30 models. So how do we do the consensus? How do we go from 5 or 30 models to one single prediction? Because usually the models are not going to be exactly predicting the same thing. Very simply, for each pixel of the individual models, there is an occurrence probability, and the consensus is the sum of individual probabilities by the number of models, and also we have weighted the models by the accuracy of each individual model. So it's kind of a weighted average, very simply. So in summary, we have the occurrence points, we have the model, and that's what we found. We have a kind of a potential distribution, which is in fact a degree of suitability for each pixel for the species. So you can see it with colors, and from that we can make our analysis. Of course, we have the same for the future with the climatic models, which means that we can make the comparison between what is suitable now and what is going to be suitable in the future. You can see, for example, in Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, that it's going to be a little bit, it's a little bit more suitable now than it's going to be in the future for that species, or that's in northern South America. It's also the case for that species. Okay, so that's for the 2 systems. The first system is invasive ants. So why did we choose invasive ants as a model study? For many reasons. The first reason is that there's a lot of ants that are available. There's about 20,000 that are described already, but there are probably much more. And 200 of them have been established outside the native range. About 20 of them are highly invasive. Highly invasive meaning, well, I'll tell you later. But mostly, they are very good at being transported around in the world. You can see on this map the point of origin and the point of destination, and you see how messy it is. Basically, those 19 ants, they come from everywhere, and they go everywhere. And that's the resulting occurrence map of all these ants. They have invaded everywhere already. Not all of them have invaded everywhere, but everywhere there is at least one invasive ant already. We also are interested in ants because their impact are diverse and very important. They are important for biodiversity. They affect plants, native ants, numerous arthropods, birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals. Basically, they are extremely efficient, they are extremely aggressive, and they clean up everything when they arrive somewhere. They're also important because due to their impact directly on biodiversity, they have huge consequences for ecosystem processes like seed dispersal, pollination, nutrient cycles, and community structure. You can very easily imagine that when they kill pollinators or when they prevent them from pollinating, that is going to disperse pollination. When they remove ants that are seed dispersers, the native ants, then it's going to affect the dynamics of the plants. They're also very harmful for human societies. There are problems in agroecosystems that are invaded, infestation of houses, and so decrease of real estate value, for example. Destruction of electrical equipment for some of them. Stings and allergies. They can be disease vectors in hospitals, and they can occur economic costs that are really important. That's the example of the red imported fire ant, which is estimated to cost to the US every year $1 billion. And I think it's something quite similar in Australia. And those guys, when they sting you, it's really extremely painful. And it is said to cause anaphylactic shock in thousands of Americans every year, and there are even over 100 deaths per year due to this little ant. So one of the reasons why we study invasive ants is that they have huge impacts. And the best reason probably is that they have awesome, scary names. So I love working with those destructive ants, crazy ants, ghost ants, fire ants. It's really scary. There are some counterexamples, of course. Flower ants doesn't count, but mostly they are really cool to work with. So those are the 15 that we work on. Now to the results. So some invasive species will benefit from climate change. That's really clear. We looked here at the Asian needle ants. You can see in the near future, a little bit later and still later, that the suitable area is going to be increasing quite a lot. On this map, I've put in yellow the suitable areas that are going to remain stable. So that's areas that are suitable now that will remain stable in the future. In red, it's gains, so it's not suitable now, but it's going to be suitable in the future. And in blue, it's loss, so it's not suitable. It is suitable now, but it's not going to be suitable in the future. And you can see on this map that there is almost no blue and a lot of red. So for this species, there's going to be more suitable areas that there is now. And if you look at different continents, I thought you might like this one, because some species are going to find more suitable area in some places and not in others. So it's interesting also to look at the distinction in different regions of the world. The other point that is interesting here is that it's not only a size of the suitable area that is important, but also the quality, the level of suitability within the suitable area. You can see with this other species that the reddish area are a bit of the same size, are more or less the same. But you can also see that in most regions, Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America, that is going to become more red in the regions that are suitable for these species. Put back on this kind of simplifying graph, the percentage of suitable area into 5 different categories from low to excellent. You can see that the low and medium quality suitability area are going to decrease, while high and excellent habitat are going to increase. So even though the species is not supposed to have more suitable area, it's going to have more quality suitable area, and so establishment is much more likely. So does this mean that climate change is making invasion worse? Not always. We have exactly the opposite. This is the big-headed ant, and you can see that there is a decrease in favorable habitat in all regions of the world, and quite a lot of it. It's really to shrink a lot. If we look at the quality of the habitat, it's also going to decrease. So not only there's going to be less suitable habitat, but this habitat that is remaining is going to be less suitable, with especially very high and excellent habitat that are going to decrease a lot. And if we look at the time horizon, as we go away in the future, as climate changes, the percentage of suitable area is really going to decrease a lot. So I told you yes, and then I told you no. So what's the general pattern? Over the species, the 15 species, now, currently, the suitable area is quite important. You can see that over the global landmass of the planet, on average, there's like 10% that is suitable for those 15 invasive ants, which is quite worrisome. If we look at the change with climate change, So as we get darker, we get more climate change. It's further in the future. And you can see that some species are going to increase the amount of suitable area, and some are going to decrease. So there are very different things that are going on here. So if we try to summarize what is happening on this table, you can see that you have 5 species that are going to increase the quantity of suitable area. You have 3 that are going to remain stable, and you have 7 that are going to decrease. So we have a bit of everything. Interestingly, among the 7 that are going to decrease, there are 3 that are said to be among the worst of the worst. Okay, but all of this is really at the global scale. Now, if I look at regional scales, like continental scales, you can see that it's a pattern that is going to be a bit different. So not only it's different for each species, but it's different for each continent. You can see that each species is not going to react the same way. Some continents are going to be less affected, some more, and some species are going to increase on some continents and decrease on some other continents. And some species are going to have a high quantity of suitable habitat in one place and decrease in the future in another place, and vice versa. So it's really something that is difficult to summarize as a single pattern. Now, if we looked at regions, of course, it's interesting to look at some specific regions. For example, the biodiversity hotspots. Those are the Earth's richest and most endangered ecoregion on Earth, biologically speaking. There's 45 of them now, because you probably know that there's a new one that has been found or established in Australia, the forest of the eastern coast. But when we did this study, there were 34 only. So biodiversity hotspots are really important because they combine a quite small area of landmass, yet over 50% of the world's plant species and 42% of the terrestrial vertebrate species that are endemic are found in these 34 hotspots, and they are some of the most endangered. So each dollar that is spent on biodiversity hotspots is supposedly going to make a bigger difference than if it's spent around Paris, for example. So here is kind of a summary of the potential habitat in percentage in the world. In light blue, it's now, and in dark blue, it's in the future. So as I said, it's quite important. We have about, on average, 10% of all of the habitat on Earth that is suitable climatically for invasive ants, for those 15 invasive ants. But in the hotspots, it's even worse. You can see in the hotspots, which are already fragile ecosystems and very rich ones, that some species are not going to find suitable habitat there, but some are going to find huge proportion of hotspots in biodiversity hotspots. So that's not really a good news, and in fact the problem is that it's going to become even worse. Here you have the difference between now and in the future. So what is in red is an increase of suitable area in the future for the 15 species, and what is in green is a decrease of suitable area. So we want it to be green because it means that there's less suitable area in the future. So that's for the world, and if we look at the hotspots, then it's much more red than it's green. That's the opposite than for the world. So not only the hotspots are more suitable for invasive species now, but they are going to be increasingly more suitable in the future, much more than the rest of the world, which is bad luck. Okay, so in conclusion for the first sample, the sample of the 15 ants, we can say that some, but not all, invaders will benefit from climate change. There's no unique trend. 5 species increase, 7 decrease, 3 remains stable, and there is no overall systematic increase, which is contrary to the dogma that according to which climate change and invasion will act synergistically, according to which climate change was going to favor invasive species. The things that we wanted to test, in fact, has no ground with those 15 species. The results are heterogeneous across species and regions, even in a relatively small and taxonomically narrow sample. So that's a point I would like to insist on. We have 15 species in the same family. For us, this distance, an ant is an ant. They all behave in kind of a similar way, ecologically speaking. They have a niche that is very similar. And yet, the impact of climate change on those 15 invasive ants is going to be hugely different according to the species. So is this due to this family? Is this family especially bizarre, or can we test it on a larger, wider sample? That's what we did with the 100 of the world's worst alien invasive species. That's the IUCN that made up this list. It's a very large number of experts of many, many species that put together a list mostly for communication purposes to attract attention on the fact that invasive species were problematic. So their criteria were first that the species had to have a large impact on biodiversity and or on human activities. They wanted it to be quite wide in terms of taxonomy, ecosystem types of impact. So for example, they cannot have 2 species of the same genus. Yet there are 5 ants on the 100, which again insists on the fact that invasive ants are really a problem. And also it had to illustrate the various issues associated with biological invasions. So with this list, we have a bit of everything. We have aquatic plants, we have microorganisms, we have mammals, we have terrestrial invertebrates, etc. So it's very heterogeneous. So we did the same thing. We took occurrence samples from various sources, databases, references, personal communication, a lot from the experts of these different species, and we had something like 40,000 occurrence points, an average of about 4,000 per species. So that's quite a lot of points that then we used in the models exactly in the same way that I just showed you before, with bioclimatic models with climatic data, but this time we also use land use data to try to project the niche of suitability of those 100 species. And this is the kind of results that we get from those kind of data. So you cannot really see very well here, but for each species we have a map with the suitability of the environment, both climatically and land use, like the habitat. And here, as it gets red, it's not really suitable, but where it's green, yellow and green, then it's really suitable. Okay, so from these kind of maps, we chose a threshold of suitability so that we could transform them in binary maps, so either they can establish or they cannot. And this allowed us to compare the 100 species, to stack all the 100 binary maps in order to have a map that is going to show the number of species that will find suitable conditions for each pixel. So the reddish areas are the areas where there are more species that will find or that can find suitable conditions. And you can see that in this beautiful place, it's quite red as well in southeast Australia. Okay, so that's a map for the future high-risk regions for these 100 alien invasive species. We can do the same for present and for future, and we can make the yeah, so just to insist, Europe, Eastern USA, and Oceania, that's the three main points where in the future climate change is going to favor invasive species. There are some others that also are reddish. It's a bit light, so it doesn't give a striking impression, but there are some other places. But mostly those three are really where are the invasion hotspots. And if we do the difference between the current and the future, we can see something that is a message that is a bit different, because in fact, in many places, the conditions are already suitable for those invasive species. So the fact that it's going to be reddish in the future doesn't mean that they are all going to come. Sometimes they are already finding suitable conditions there. And this is quite visible here, where in Europe, in fact, you have only the north of Europe that is red. And in fact, in the south of Europe, climatic conditions are going to decrease the suitability of the habitat. So although it's still quite suitable for many species, it is less so than in the present, in the current time. So climate change is going to favor things by preventing more species to invade in South Europe and not in North Europe, where it's going to, on the contrary, be worse. There's going to be more invasive species that will find suitable conditions in Northern Europe, also in this place here in the US. And you cannot really see it here, but here it's green, meaning that climate change is not going to increase suitability of more invasive species in Australia in the future. Okay, so it's important because where it's red, it's regions where we can try to favor prevention and monitoring. And when it's green, that's opportunities for ecosystem restorations. Now we can look at the different taxonomic groups, whether we have a coherent signal, and those are all the taxonomic groups that make up the 100 species of our list. And in fact, there are three groups for which there is a strong range size diminution on the future projections. So amphibians, birds, and fungi are going to find less suitable area in the future, whereas some others are going to find even more suitable areas in the future with climate change. But in fact, if you look at the species within those taxonomic groups, you can see that it's really messy. It's going a bit in all directions. There are convergent patterns only for amphibians and microorganisms, and in fact, there are not so many of them inside the group, so it's quite easy to have a convergent pattern. And in all the other groups, it goes up and down according to the species. Now, if we do the same thing that for the ants, if we look at the biological invasions per region that are divided that way, then we have some regions that are going to be to find suitable habitat, like this region in green, Oceania, or in blue, South America, more than some others, like Eurasia is going to be suitable for fewer invasive species, or the Arctic region also. And if you look at the difference between the present and the future, then some regions again stand apart as not only being very suitable globally for invasive species, or more suitable than most of the rest, but also as being increasingly more suitable. And we looked at the hotspots for the ants, so we looked also at the hotspots for the 100 species, simply by putting this hotspot map on the 100 species map, and we can look at the number of species that are going to find suitable conditions in each of the hotspots. So we can select all the hotspots individually and look per pixel the number of species that will find suitable conditions with climate change. So that's this hotspot in South America, and we have the average number of species that will find suitable conditions for invasion in this region. So we can do that for all the hotspots. It's a bit messy, but we can see at a glance that some hotspots are not going to be so hospitable for invasive species, but some others are much more hospitable. And that could be really a problem because those hotspots, as I mentioned before, are really fragile already. So with climate change, that's the map of the difference between now and when the climate has changed. I think that's 2080. In purple, it's places where there's going to be more invasive species or more, the suitable conditions for more invasive species. And in orange and yellow, suitable conditions for fewer invasive species. So you can see that some places are orange or mostly yellow, and many are purple and dark purple. And so that's the graph that I showed you before, the number of invasive species per pixel following climate change. And if we look at the difference between the future and now, no difference between on this line, you can see that there are many that are above this line, so that they are going to become even more favorable, hospitable for invasive species, while a few are going to be less hospitable for invasive species. So, as I said, hotspots, the biodiversity hotspots, are generally more suitable to invasive species. They are more likely more species are more likely to invade. Here it's the hotspot, and here it's the world. You can see that there is a huge difference. So the conclusion for the biological invasions in the hotspots: biodiversity hotspots are highly vulnerable to biological invasions. They are already suitable to many invasive species, more in some others, more than the rest of the world. On average, each pixel of the hotspot is favorable to 14 of the 100 worst invaders, and some are even more vulnerable, like French Polynesia, 35 species. Talking about French hospitality, that's something that is a bit problematic there. And with climate change, they are more likely to be invaded than the rest of the world, so it's going to be even worse. Of course, we didn't look at the effect of on biodiversity. That's something that is very difficult to quantify. But there is no reason to think that it's not going to be as dramatic as it is elsewhere. Those species are really well known for their impact, so it's really something that is of a concern here. And I remind you that we had similar findings for the 15 ants, more invasions in the hotspots, and even more so in the future. So the conclusion for this second part, the 100 of the worst, is again that there is no unique trend. Some taxa globally increase, some decrease, and most differed within taxa and within regions. Within regions, the results were heterogeneous as well, and some regions are going to be further invaded, some less invaded. However, within the biodiversity hotspots, most species showed a strong increase in the quantity of suitable area that they find. And even when species distribution decreased, or if fewer species invaded some regions, the overall pattern is a lot of invasions everywhere. Because when I say we're going to decrease, sometimes we go from 20 invasive species to 15 or 12 invasive species. But 12 invasive species is not really a good news. Okay, so will climate change affect biological invasions? Yes. How? Which species? Which regions? It depends. But in any case, climate change will not suppress biological invasions. And the problem here is that one species only is really a problem. And we are talking about several species. Okay, with this, I would like to thank, of course, the two main actors of this work, Céline Bella and Cléo Bertelsmeyer. all our co-authors that help us on various issues of these different papers, and our funding bodies. And of course you for your attention. Thank you.